are here at the Sacramento History Museum in our print shop exhibit. And throughout this month, I have been discussing early newspapers here in California. The first week I was discussing the first newspapers published, such as the Californian and the California Star on the coast. And you have the first Sacramento newspaper, the Placer Times, published on April 28, 1849. Last time I talked about the first daily newspapers. Now I want to talk a little bit about specific community-based newspapers, and what better one to talk about than the first Chinese newspaper here in Sacramento. Sacramento had a growing Chinese population in the early to mid 1850s. You have a mass migration of Chinese immigrants from the Guangdong province of China during the gold rush, when the word of gold spread, and it spread internationally. And it was actually quicker to get to California from China than it was from New York during the gold rush. San Francisco grew as the first city. Sacramento was the second city. We were known as Yifao in Guamsan, which means Gold Mountain. That's what Chinese called California at this time. The first Chinese newspaper in California, though, is in San Francisco. On April 28, 1854, was the first edition of the first Chinese newspaper. It was called the Golden Hill News, and it was published weekly. But I thought what was really interesting with it was that this was a lithographed paper. So they, if anybody knows the process of lithography, they are making one large block essentially for printing their paper. Versus what we know of letterpress printing with individual characters. The first Sacramento newspaper, the first Chinese Sacramento newspaper, was near I and 3rd Street, which is where the Chinatown was here in Sacramento, where present day the Amtrak station is. That's the Chinese community had businesses, they had markets, they had community centers, and they had their own newspaper. It was first published in December 1856 by Yi Tu Yun, and I've set the type for what this newspaper was called. And this newspaper didn't last long. It was published from December 1856 until 1858. I'm gonna get some rubber-based ink from our inkstone here. Roll it across our wood type that have been locked in a form using furniture and coins. A little bit more here. Now, we are unsure of why this newspaper in particular ended. This information that I'm sharing with you comes from Edward Kemble's History of California Newspapers. Edward Kemble was the publisher of the Placer Times, first in 1849 in Sacramento, and he wrote a history of all the newspapers here. And I need just a little bit larger of a piece of paper.
We just got a phone call and they can't hear us. Can we not hear them, or they can't hear us?
Place our paper here on our form. Take some padding. Close the bed. Run the bed underneath the platen. Pull the devil's tail here. Activating the figure 4 toggle. Making that impression. And that's why it's called a printing press. This is our Washington hand press, after all, manufactured in 1852, and this would have been the type of hand press used for printing newspapers at this time of the gold rush in Sacramento in the 1850s. That newspaper, that first Chinese newspaper, was the Chinese news, and it actually went by a couple different names depending on the source. Actually, some called it the China Daily News, some called it the Sacramento Chinese News. What we know is from both Kemble and a couple other sources, the Chinese news was what the English translation was. But this was just a short-lived newspaper, and we wanted to highlight it today as we're highlighting the histories of different newspapers here in California this month. Thank you for joining me here at the Sacramento History Museum. You all have a great rest of your day. Bye, everybody.
Come this way, please.